Okay, so this talk is loosely based on a tech report with Barbara Liskov at MIT and Luba Shvira at Brandeis University. I'm your speaker. You're going to hear a lot about the techniques of blockchains in this workshop, so I'd like to focus on the bigger picture, on what it is that we can do with blockchains and what we still don't know how to do. In particular, I want to argue that blockchains are best understood as a natural progression of classical distributed computing, which may come as a surprise because the terminology is different and nobody cites one another's papers. But I think this is really the most productive way to look at things. Now, people who work in distributed computing often think in terms of adversaries. So your job is to write an algorithm that will be tormented by an adversary that has certain powers. So in classical distributed computing, we have a kind of somewhat harmless, cute adversary. This adversary has limited powers. It can control timing. Messages can be late. One clock can be slow, one clock can be fast. Server can crash. Sometimes timing and crashes interact and you don't know whether a server is crashed or slow. Messages can be lost. At the limit, there are some kinds of failures that are too complicated to characterize, so we say, oh, this is Byzantine, meaning that it could do almost anything. We don't really think it's malicious, we just think that it's complicated. And given that, we tend to focus on abstract, idealized mathematical problems like consensus, case-set agreement, all of the usual things. Now, in retrospect, this seems like a kind of a charming and naive view of the world, because today, with the spread of the internet, life is much more complicated. And today, our adversaries are actually hackers, governments, organizations, organized crime, all kinds of very resourceful and intelligent adversaries, not mathematical abstractions. The kinds of attacks are much more powerful and subtle. These are two attacks where you can use side channels to read secure storage by measuring the time it takes to for a cache to read a value from a cache, things like that. The various attacks, the attack surfaces, the vectors are much more complicated and much more dangerous than they were. We're not worried about solving consensus. We're worried about holding elections. We're worried about fake news. So things have become much more difficult and in some sense much more important. And again, the premise of this talk is that the way to understand how to deal with these more complicated and dangerous threats is by approaching them through classical distributed computing. So what I want to talk about is how the transition from a classical adversary to this more menacing adversary causes us to rethink our notions of correctness. So I'm going to give you examples of algorithms, but I don't have time to go into them in detail. I want to give you a flavor of what this new world looks like. But I really want to focus on how we have to change the way we think about what it means for a distributed algorithm to be correct. By the way, if anyone has any questions, feel free to interrupt. So in the classical world, we're often concerned with notions of consistency and atomicity. And I want to argue that naively translating these notions into a blockchain-like world doesn't make any sense, that we need to think about these things somewhat differently. And it's very confusing because sometimes people use the same words in both domains, but they mean somewhat different things. And it's possible to have a long conversation with someone where only at the end you realize that you've been using the same words to discuss different topics. So let me tell you a story. So our friend Carol owns a pink Cadillac. And she wants to sell it for Bitcoin. I'm not going to comment on the wisdom of this choice, but that's what she wants. Now, it so happens that Alice has a big pile of altcoins, some cryptocurrency that isn't Bitcoin. And like all of us, she really wants to own a pink Cadillac. Now, it turns out that there's a third party, Bob, has a pile of Bitcoins, which he wants to trade for altcoins. So naturally, the way to put these together is we would like to do a three-way transfer. Each party is better off by exchanging its possessions for something else. And so we would really like to come up with a way of doing this three-way transfer. Now, of course, nobody trusts anybody here. The parties don't trust each other. Nobody trusts banks, governments, exchanges, any kind of centralized organization. And what we need is a way to execute this three-way swap without a single point of failure with respect to trust. So we assume that if anybody has the chance, they will pick your pocket. But we want to guarantee that we can do commerce to everyone's mutual advantage without anybody having to trust anyone else. Now this, of course, is kind of naive because we trust the algorithms, we trust all kinds of things. But to a first approximation, let's say that we don't trust anyone. This is a special case of a more general pattern, which we'll call adversarial commerce, where everybody here has some kind of asset that they want to trade. For example, David here would like to acquire a nice car, in return for which he's happy to sell a rare stamp and some spices. So everybody here has something coming in and something going out. And again, the goal is to make all of these things happen in a way that doesn't allow anyone to be cheated. Now, what we'll see is that if you try to make precise the exact meaning of correctness for this kind of commerce, things can get very subtle and very complicated. So you might think you know what it means for this to be correct, but you're probably not, you probably missed something. Now, I'm not going to actually settle this. I'm going to point out some of the difficulties, propose some ideas, but this is still an area of active research. So each party wants to trade assets. This isn't just swaps. You could have multi-hop transfers. You could have a broker who takes money from one place and then sells things to other places. You could do auctions. So this is, technically speaking, this is more powerful than simple cross-chain swaps. That's a technical aside. So each asset lives on its own database or blockchain. And again, nobody trusts anyone. And this is the key. And similar things are done in classical distributed computing using what's called distributed transactions. And this looks very similar to a distributed transaction. But the differences, I think, are profound. And again, it's confusing because of the superficial resemblance. And when I started working on this, I thought, oh, this is easy. We've been doing this for 50 years. We know exactly what needs to be done. And it turns out to be not that simple. Okay, in classical world, typically you execute a transaction, you have a trusted centralized controller. The controller says, okay, everybody make tentative updates to your databases. Okay, everybody write your changes to stable storage so they're not lost on a crash. Okay, everybody send me acknowledgement that you've made your tentative backup. Okay, now everybody commit. This is two-phase commit protocol, similar kinds of things. This does not work in the kind of modern world because you don't trust the central controller. The central controller could try to steal things. The central controller could just be méchant and say, okay, lock everything up, and then walk away and leave you with all your resources inaccessible. Now, in the classical world, there are a number of correctness criteria. I'm only going to talk about the most interesting ones because I don't have time to do everything. But the first thing you would ask is atomicity. Either everybody trades with everyone else or nothing happens. We don't want partial executions because that leaves somebody worse off. And in order to execute this, we have mechanisms that guarantee isolation, which say that you don't see intermediate states of computations. Serializability, snapshot, isolation, there are many classical mechanisms that provide this kind of thing. These are the two main correctness criteria in the classical world. In the blockchain world, we're going to ask the same questions, but we have a smart adversary. In other words, we don't trust anyone. Everyone could either be trying to steal things from you or just to do mischief and keep your assets locked up for as long as possible. And we want to have this work in the context of blockchains and smart contracts. Now, I think you all know what blockchains are, but I'm going to explain my personal point of view. A blockchain at the abstract level is very simple. At the implementation level, it's very complicated, but the abstract level, this is just a ledger. A ledger is an invention of the Italian Renaissance where you keep track of something, of events. It's append only. You're not allowed to go back and erase anything. You can add new entries onto the end. If you make a mistake, you can add a correcting entry. This is how ledgers in businesses work. The events don't have to be financial. Of course, people are interested in cryptocurrencies and financial events, payments, things like that. But it really could be anything. It could be a file system, could be an operating system. It could be anything you want. And it has the property that everyone agrees on the content. Even if you don't trust other parties, there's an unambiguous protocol where everybody who evaluates the ledger honestly, they agree on what it says. And of course, it's tamper-proof, meaning that it's impossible to go back and change anything that happened in the past. Now, the mechanism that we're going to use is something called smart contracts. Again, you're probably all familiar with it, but the first important thing is that smart contracts is a marketing term. Smart contracts are not contracts in any legal sense, and they're not particularly smart. Smart contract is just kind of a Python script that runs on a blockchain. But what it is, it's a script that allows you to control transfers of assets. It says, if this condition holds, then take this asset and assign ownership to someone else. Again, the idea is simple. The implementation can get very complicated, but from the point of view of someone using the system, it's not terribly complicated or difficult. Now I'm going to describe some of the mechanisms that you can use in smart contracts to execute the kinds of distributed swaps and deals that we saw earlier. Now the first notion is something called the hash lock. A hash lock is a way of saying that I'm going to put some assets in escrow and keep them locked up until I learn a secret. So the idea here is I'm going to make up a secret, a random number, and then I'm going to hash that secret. The secret, of course, is something I don't tell anyone. The hash of the secret I can tell everyone, because cryptographic hashes, it's impossible to invert them in any reasonable way. So I can create a secret, keep it to myself. I can broadcast the hash of the secret, and later I can prove that I know the secret, and that I knew the secret at the time that I did the broadcast, because it's easy to check that the secret and the hash match. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to design a contract that takes an asset in escrow, which means that it's locked up. So an escrow is a little bit like in PayPal, where if you order some furniture, you give some money to a third account. The third account keeps hold of the money until everyone agrees that the deal is good. So the contract does not know the secret, but it knows the hash of the secret. And if the secret is provided, then it completes the transfer. So if I order some furniture, it's locked up with a hash. If I'm happy with the furniture, I release the secret. The contract says, yes, these match, and then it transfers the money to, or the furniture to me and the money to the seller. Now there's a problem that if you lock something up, what happens if the other party just goes away? So, that's one kind of attack. So instead, we'll also add a kind of a timeout. In the language of blockchains, this is called a hashed time lock. So there's some time, big delta, which says that if you do not provide the secret within time, big delta, then we say, oh, sorry, take too long, and you give everyone back their assets. So the combination of the hash lock and the time lock are going to be our main tool for implementing these deals. Now, we're assuming that the network is synchronous, that there is some delta that's long enough that you can put something on a blockchain and everyone else can notice it. In practice, this can be very long. This can be 24 hours, 48 hours. There are good things and bad things about that I don't have time to discuss. There are also alternative approaches which we describe in the tech report that work in eventually synchronous systems. But again, I don't have time to talk about that. I'm going to focus on the synchronous model here, just because there isn't time to cover everything. So here is a sample of how you could implement the three-way swap that I talked about before. Again, I'm not going to try to prove that it's correct. I'm not going to explore all the different failure modes. You're going to have to trust me that this actually works. But I want to give you a feeling for what these algorithms look like. This is not the only algorithm, but this is, in some sense, the canonical one. So Alice invents a secret. So she thinks of a random number and publishes the hash of that number. Then she puts a contract on the blockchain. And the order in which everything happens here is extremely important, because if you do things in the wrong order, you can be cheated. And the contract says, I will transfer my altcoins to Bob with the hash lock, the hash of this secret. But this must complete within 6 times delta. And the 6 is also important. I will try to explain it later. Then when Bob sees that that contract is posted on the blockchain, and only after that, Bob creates a similar contract, says, okay, transfer my bitcoins to Carol with the same hash lock, and this must be completed within time 5 delta. So we've gone from 6 delta to 5 delta, because it could take delta for Bob to notice that this contract appears. So we do the same thing. Carol transfers the title to her Cadillac, hash lock, same hash lock, time lock for delta. So each arrow here is a different blockchain. Each of these is a smart contract that controls the asset. Currently, each asset is owned by the contract, because all of the assets are in escrow. If I have to put my, say, bitcoins in escrow, because I could just grab them and walk away after I get my Cadillac. So everything here sort of fits together in a very delicate way. Okay, now all the contracts are in place. So we're going to start the second phase of the protocol. So now Alice reveals S. She sends S to the contract and says, give me the title to the car. Here is the secret. The contract checks that the hash of the secret and the secret match. And the contract says, okay, you gave me the correct secret. The time lock has not expired. Here is your Cadillac. Now, a side effect of this is that Carol has now learned what the secret is, because when you send the secret to the smart contract, it's on the blockchain. Everything on the blockchain is public. So now Carol knows what the secret is. Carol can take that secret and forward it. So now Carol reveals the secret, which causes the Bitcoin to be transferred. Now, each of these transition takes time at most delta, preferably much, much less. But this is why we needed 6 delta, because we're going around the loop in different directions twice. And there are 3 three parties. So this continues, and this triggers each of these transfers. Now, what I don't have time to go through is you can think of all the ways people could try to cheat. One party could refuse to reveal a secret, in which case it would time out. One party could, for example, try to apply the secrets out of order. It turns out that doesn't matter. A party could fail to respond within time delta, in which case they're the ones who would lose. So it turns out that this protocol actually works, although proving it's correct is not trivial. So, but there are many subtle issues here about what it means for this to be correct. And again, if you approach this naively and you say, well, this is just a distributed transaction, let's look at our familiar distributed transaction properties that we know and love for so many years, you discover that this doesn't work. That what's different here is the fact that nobody trusts anybody and the fact that you can't force anyone to behave. There's an implicit assumption in classical distributed computing that you can dictate the algorithm to everyone. So if I have a distributed Oracle database, I can say, okay, everybody, you run this protocol. You can crash, your messages can be missing, but I can guarantee that everybody is either running the protocol or they're crashed or broken or something. What I can't do is say, okay, everybody here, please, I suggest you use this protocol. If you depart from the protocol, then maybe I can detect it and maybe I can't. You assume that everyone is trying to reach agreement. You don't assume that everybody is basically trying to steal from you, which is what we need to do in this context. Oops. So here's the model that I think is the right way to do things. So we'll divide the parties into two kinds. There are the conforming parties who follow the protocol. Now, we're not assuming the conforming parties are honest or non-faulty or so on. They just follow the protocol. You know, they do what is expected of them. And then the deviating parties can do anything. So the deviating parties will do something other than what the protocol says. And we don't assume anything about whether, about their motivation, whether they're faulty or anything. You either follow the protocol or you don't follow the protocol. So this is different from many of the classical models. We don't say that we're not interested in honest versus dishonest. We're not moralists here. We're not saying faulty versus non-faulty. We're not talking about rational versus irrational. Just conforming versus deviating. It's a very simple idea. And the first question is, okay, so why would anybody follow a protocol? Since I can't force you to follow the protocol, I can only suggest it. Why would you pay attention to me? And here we need to use a little bit of game theory. So strong Nash equilibrium says that, well, there's a default, which is everybody follows the protocol. This is kind of the chef's suggestion. And it says that if you have a coalition that decides to deviate, so you and your friends get together and say, nah, we're not going to follow this protocol. Here's something else we could do instead, that you don't, you're not better off. Now, this has to be a coalition and not an individual because we don't have strong identities. There are, Sybil attacks, sock puppets, things like that. There could be a large number of parties who are actually controlled by the same evil James Bond villain. So we can't say individual departure is bad. We need to talk about coalitions. So henceforth, I'm going to assume that whatever protocol we consider has the property that following the protocol is a strong Nash equilibrium. So that if you're rational, you'll follow the protocol, because if you propose a protocol that's not a strong Nash equilibrium, no one will follow it. Why would they? So this is a kind of a basic prerequisite. Now, this does not mean that everyone is going to follow the protocol, because some of the parties might be irrational. They might have been hacked. They might be working for a hostile government, and they don't want to steal your money, they just want to crash the system. So you can't assume that everyone follows the protocol, even if it's in their interests to do so. Now, one theorem that I don't have time to talk about is that in something like this adversarial commerce, where everyone is trying to trade with everyone else, a Nash equilibrium protocol is possible only if this directed graph is strongly connected. If it's not strongly connected, it turns out that there are regions of the graph that take assets but never release them, in which case it's always a better strategy for the others to ignore them. I can pretend I paid the free rider and just keep that, and no one will tell because all of the communication goes in but nothing comes out. So it has to be strongly connected. It would be fun to talk about that, but not here. Okay, so let's revisit our classical correctness criteria. So remember, in a distributed atomic transaction, the most basic property is you want everything to happen correctly or nothing happens. We don't want to crash in any intermediate state. Now, it turns out it's not too hard to see that this property is impossible to provide in this context. We cannot provide all or nothing in an environment where we can't dictate the algorithm that the proponents are using, because some of the parties might be irrational. So here is a situation where we're partway through. Alice has posted the contract here. Bob has posted the contract here, but we haven't yet but Carol has not yet released the contract. So in this place, Alice might reveal the secret prematurely. We can't prevent Alice from doing this because Alice might be irrational. There might be a virus on Alice's system. And if that happens, then as soon as that's revealed, Bob will immediately grab the altcoin. Carol will immediately grab the Bitcoin. But at this point, Alice is out of luck because there is no contract that guarantees that she gets her Cadillac. Oh, sorry, that she gets that she gets the Cadillac. And in this case, Alice departed from the protocol, but only Alice pays for it. But there's no way to prevent that. So this is not an all or nothing execution. This is an intermediate state where things are broken, but we can't prevent this. So this has to be an acceptable outcome. And the key insight is that the only party who ends up worse off is Alice, who deviated from the protocol by releasing the secret too early. Bob and Carol, who followed the protocol, they're greedy and dishonest, but they follow the protocol. And as soon as Alice departs from the protocol, they can exploit this to grab their assets. And Carol ends up with both the Bitcoin and the car title. So that suggests that two properties. One thing is if all the parties conform, then the transfers happen. And the other is if some parties deviate, then the honest parties are not worse off. So we can't make any guarantees about what happens if you don't conform. But we guarantee that if you conform, maybe you'll get the Cadillac and maybe you don't. But in any case, you don't end up worse off. Now, of course, you should all be looking at this with great suspicion because defining worse off in this context is something I could give 2 more lectures about. There are all very subtle issues in what constitutes being worse off. Well, maybe the deal doesn't happen. Maybe you wasted time, some fees. That's inevitable. But you're not going to lose a valuable asset. So in place of all or nothing, what we guarantee is that if everybody is good, then the all part happens. If somebody's bad, then the conforming parties are still okay. And of course, this is, if you think about it, this is kind of a natural and necessary property because you're not going to join in the deal if it's possible for you to be cheated. So you know that if you join in this deal and you're honest, then maybe you get what you want. Maybe you waste some time and don't get what you want, but nobody is going to steal your car. There's the other property which says that no party observes another's intermediate state. You can think of this as database serializability. Now, literally, this property makes no sense in the protocol that I showed you because everybody sees everyone else's intermediate states. First you post the contract, then you reveal the secret. There's a lot of interaction between the parties. So this is not even close to being a serializable execution. And yet, this principle has a kind of a different interpretation. And that's the notion of escrow. So before you can do anything in this model, you have to take your asset and put it under control of a third party, typically a smart contract. So Alice, for example, has to put her Bitcoins into escrow. So she transfers ownership of her Bitcoins to the smart contract, because otherwise, halfway through, she could grab her money and spend it someplace else. So the idea here is that before you can do anything, you have to take the assets and lock them up. You have to be careful that they don't stay locked up forever, because smart contracts, as I said before, are not actually all that smart. And it's possible, and indeed has happened, that large amounts of money end up being locked up forever because of bugs in the smart contracts that prevent these assets from being revealed. Okay, so what happens here is that Alice, Bob, and Carol put their assets in escrow. So their assets are locked up, and they no longer control them. They put these under the control of the smart contracts. And this is similar in spirit, although technically completely different, than locking, say two-phase locking in a distributed database. Two-phase locking says that nobody can modify something while I'm using it. In this case, we're saying nobody can spend an asset. So it's a very analogous property, but it's not, it's not exactly the same, but in spirit, it fills the same niche. And it guarantees that nobody can withdraw their assets in the middle. I can't say, okay, so I put my money on the table, and you put something else on the table, and then I grab the money and your goods and then run. This is intended to be impossible. Now, there's kind of a delicate balance here between the fact that once I put my assets in escrow, I can no longer control them, so I don't steal them. But perhaps my adversary's goal is to have my assets locked up forever. So without the timeout, for example, I could put my assets in escrow and wait for the secret to be revealed, and if Alice says, haha, I'm leaving, then my money is locked up forever. Alice can't steal it, but maybe Alice didn't want to steal my money, she just wanted me to lose access to it. So the choice of how the hash locks and the time locks interact is a very complicated and subtle problem, which I think has only been partly solved. So in the real world, people who do trading, they don't like time locks because I put my assets in escrow and say, if I don't get the secret within 24 hours, then give me my money back. 24 hours is a long time in cryptocurrency world. The value of Bitcoin can go up and down, and if my assets are locked up and I can't sell them, then that's a form of attack. So that in some sense, what we're doing with this protocol, is as if I'm offering you an option. So I lock up my Bitcoin and say, okay, when you release the secret, you can trade it for the altcoin. Then you can look at it, wait for 23 hours and say, well, Bitcoin went up, okay, I'm going to do the trade. No, Bitcoin went down, sorry, I'm not going to do the trade. So this is, in real life, there are lots of options, but you always pay a fee. In this situation, what I've described, there is no fee. So, there are many, practical complications with this, fairly simple protocol that, people I know who do trading, they get very alarmed about this. But this is a research challenge. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here. So again, I've tried to avoid too much technical detail here because I want to say focus on the big picture. And the big picture here is that the blockchain world is a kind of an alternate universe to the distributed computing world. Many of the structures in the blockchain world have recognizable analogs. It's like the biology of Australia. You know, you can recognize European animals, except they're transformed in strange ways. So you can think of the blockchain world as sort of marsupial distributed computing. And on the one hand, this is powerful because we can take everything we know in our experience about classical distributed computing, and that goes a long way toward understanding many of the complicated issues. But you have to be careful and not be overconfident because there are many radically different aspects. In particular, the idea that nobody trusts anyone else and the idea that you can't dictate the code that people are running. The best you can do is you can say the default strategy is you follow this protocol, and if you depart from the protocol, then maybe we detect it and maybe we don't. If we detect it, then we can punish you. If we can't detect it, you still can't profit. And the design of this kind of protocol requires a different kind of thinking, different kind of proof techniques. In particular, the classical notions of atomicity and isolation, we replace those with the requirement that your protocol, that following your protocol should be a strong Nash equilibrium. Again, this is something that almost never shows up in the classical world. We want to guarantee that it's live, that the deal happens if everyone conforms. It can't deadlock or live lock. This notion that if you're not careful, your assets may be locked up forever does show up in some locking protocols, but it's usually considered a fringe case. But this is a very real concern in the blockchain world. You want to guarantee that it's safe for conforming parties, that if you behave correctly, you can't be cheated. And again, this is something that has no classical analog because all we care about, we say all or nothing, you know, either it happens or it doesn't happen. But we cannot technically guarantee all or nothing because we can't avoid the possibility of irrational behavior by some of the parties. And we want to guarantee that if someone is irrational, that they can't damage the conforming parties. And then there's notions, for example, that escrow guarantees isolation. This says that I can't offer you something and then grab it and run away at the wrong time. But at the same time, I can't offer you something and then have it locked up forever. And again, the tension between the notion that I need to give up control of my assets in order to guarantee the safety of the other side versus the notion that these assets cannot be locked up forever even if the other side is trying to do mischief. These are all aspects that we're not familiar with in the classical world. Okay, so that's everything I have to say.
What's the difference between atomic cross-chain swaps and atomic cross-chain deals?
So in a swap, I give you something that I own. But in a deal, I could be a broker. So let's say that you produce theater tickets, and Maria is a consumer of theater tickets. So I can take Maria's money, take 10%, and I can give it to you and get the ticket and give it to Maria. That's not a swap because I don't own either the money or the tickets, but I can be the center of this indirect transfer. And that cannot be reduced to swaps because if you deal directly, then you're not going to give me my 10%. So the fact that I control the communication between you and I take my 10% is the basis for all of modern finance. You've got somebody in the middle who's taking things, and you need to be able to model that. And swaps don't, for technical reasons, you can't reduce that to a swap.
What is the interest for me and Maria to involve you in the loop?
Because you and Maria don't know each other.
But once we,
Don't trust you.
the protocol assumes that we know each other.
No, it assumes that there are public keys. So on the theater ticket blockchain, you swap with me and then I swap with her, but you have no obvious way of figuring out Maria's public key. That Maria's public key cannot necessarily be linked to Maria. Maybe she doesn't want you to know who she is.
But again, in the protocol you described, it assumed that every participant knows every other participant's public key.
Public key, but not identity.
Right.
So it just because the whole kind of pseudo anonymity of Bitcoin is based on the assumption that if I know your public key, I can't. The tax collector might know your public key, but they can't. They don't know your home address.
And you, as a broker, is supposed to know the identity of every other participant.
All I need is a public key. So I don't need to know. You put that once you put those tickets in escrow, then you don't control them anymore. The contract controls them. It doesn't matter to me whether the public key matches onto you or someone else, as long as I can tell that the tickets are not counterfeit. Then it's okay. It's a good question. How whether these things can be broken in some sense. I haven't said anything about privacy, and that's an entirely different subject here. Also, things like auctions. I can do an auction this way where I can take something and give it to the highest bidder, which can't be reduced to a swap.
I want to buy a pink Cadillac one day. I would love to negotiate.
So there, okay, you could negotiate offline, but not. You don't want to negotiate on a blockchain because that's expensive.
Yeah.
No.
I don't know the seller of the Cadillac, right? So on your third-party scheme, how can I negotiate the price for the Cadillac?
You could do an auction. So I could be a broker. I could take the Cadillac, and I could tell everybody, here is here's a Cadillac that's for sale. Here is a smart contract that takes in all of the offers. It picks the largest, and maybe it does some Vic-Ray auction or something. So it takes everything, selects one winner, and refunds the money. You can look at the contract and convince yourself, yes, this is a correct contract. It's safe for me to submit my bid. I'm not going to keep your money and not give you the Cadillac. So an auction is probably the closest to negotiation.
It would be like first phase thing.
Yeah. And so you can implement any policy you want. It's important that you can look at the contract and make sure that the contract does what you think. And this is something that's easy in an idealized model. And in practice, looking at large amounts of bytecode is not that much fun. But in principle, it's.
And the second thing is that if I don't like the pink Cadillac at the end of the day, I have 15 days to refund possibility. Is there any way to implement it?
That's an interesting question. I think you could probably do that, but I haven't really thought about that. It's one of the weaknesses of many cryptocurrencies is if somebody steals your money, you're out of luck. So this is really law of the jungle. But I think you could probably write a contract that did something like that, but I don't. I can't guarantee it now.
I'm not sure I understand what's going on if I change my mind and suddenly I want a black Cadillac instead of a pink within the 6 delta or even.
So
I launched my contract, but suddenly after 4 deltas I changed my mind. I said, oh God, I want a black Cadillac or a Ford or Renault for the matter.
At the very beginning, if you walk away, then everyone times out and the refunds happen. So if you quit early in the protocol, then you get your money back. If you quit later in the protocol, too bad.
Too bad. So I received my pink Cadillac.
Yeah. Now, this is related to the other question, can you design a contract that gives you a longer period?
Yeah.
And I think, again, I think the answer is yes, but I won't commit to it because I haven't really thought about it. I think that would be a good, a good graduate student exercise. Maybe not paper level, but it's a non-trivial problem.
Okay, I'm sorry we're running out of time, so let's have the speaker.